why don't we start? And you have some thoughts as to how you would like to proceed?
Yeah, sure. I could at least provide a short, hopefully precise intro. The particular topic for this Global Rule of Law web seminar is, of course, the evolution of sovereignty, and it is, if you like, an aspect of the problem of the global rule of law, which Garry and I had explored in an article in Cadmus and in the first seminar. And in the first seminar, we tried to provide the notion of the rule of law in the most comprehensive sense. And that would mean transcending the national sovereignties of the 200 plus states that constitute membership of the UN. However, it struck me, and of course this is just my view on it, that one of the sticking points of generating a viable global rule of law in the comprehensive sense that we had laid it out is that we still have to overcome the problems of sovereignty or national sovereignty. And that means we need a better understanding of it. We need a better understanding of its evolution. We need a better understanding of where it is now and where we think it's going to be in the near-term future. And that's essentially what we were looking at here. Now, in my own work on this, I've done some thinking about it, and but near the end of this little statement of questions that we could look at, the fundamental question that I think still pervades international relations, international politics, and international law is the question of and the notion of law as exclusive to the sovereign state, or the notion of the law that is much more rooted in the authority of the global community. Those are the two issues that I think are at stake here. And why it's useful to bring it up in the context of the UN Charter, at least in my view, is that there are differing views on the UN Charter as there are differing views on the status of, shall we say, constitutional law. There is historically a tension about the role of the Constitution as a guidance and a restraining force on the concept of sovereignty. And the most powerful of the theories of the 19th century, which still has a tremendous traction in practice, is the notion that actually constitutional law is a bit of an illusion. It's not really law, it's a kind of pretend law. And the reason is logical. If you have the notion of sovereignty, how can you have a constitution as a super sovereign above the sovereign? You know, it's just not logically true. Hence, the main theorist of the period said, well, constitutional law, positive morality. So yeah, it's there, but it's not really law. And then the connected to this was the notion, well, international law has that same pretense to control national sovereignty. Well, is international really law, or isn't it just positive morality? See, and so when we come to the 20th century with that baggage of positivist legal theory, there's an effort to nibble away at that, but not really a frontal, if you like, attack on it. So that the conventional wisdom in scholarship of international relations and international law pays a great deal of deference to the omnipotence of sovereignty and less deference to the idea of international obligation, obligations that constrain sovereigns by reason and rationality, and so on. So that's sort of the message that we got. Now, what we know is that in the early part of the last century, when we stumbled into the First World War, it was very much a matter of sovereigns beating up on each other. and it became quite clear to many people, including Woodrow Wilson, who drafted the 14-point peace program, that we needed some form of international guidance, some form of international obligation that could constrain the sovereignty of states and therefore provide some space so that the global community doesn't stumble into another catastrophic war. And that emerged with the League of Nations. But the moment it got drafted, the sovereignty problem emerged and was basically uncontested. So what the League of Nations came up with was the notion, okay, any sovereign can stop the decision-making process of the League of Nations in its tracks if it just exercises its vote to do so. In short, sovereignty trumped the entire League of Nations, and that permitted us to, if you like, stumble into the Second World War, where the full reach of sovereignty became catastrophic, as we saw, and then there was a greater insistence that we've got to limit this thing, you see, and that's how we get the UN Charter. But even then, the strength of sovereignty emerges in the details. If you look at the preamble and the ostensible purposes for which the UN is established, well, it says, you know, all people have an interest in peace. All people have an interest in human rights and dignity, men and women, etc., etc. It goes and makes the stirring commitment to the idea that there is such a thing as an individual and the global society. But when you come to the specifics, the membership of the UN is only confined to nation states, see, sovereign nation states. Well, the UN does come up with a compromise formula which says something like this. Okay, the 5 strongest, we can assume, will basically see their own self-interest in cooperation. We put them in the Security Council and we give them the veto. You know, now when we look around, we see the abuse of the veto over the virtual life of the UN. And the crisis the UN is confronted with when you have threats to the peace, breach of the peace, etc., etc. But a permanent member vetoes any action, and the very purpose for which the UN is created is undermined. And then the question is, what do you do with Syria and the terrible tale of UN impotence in the Balkans and Africa and various other places. So it still raises its head. Now, at another level, we have accepted the idea that today a major force that explains the global social, political and legal process is the notion of globalization. And then we have a question, what is globalization? Where does sovereignty fit into the facts of globalization? And one of our fellows, Dick Falk, suggested that this notion of globalization is a reflection of a weakening of the traditional boundaries of the sovereign state. They become porous because of trade, investment, communications, etc., etc. And so there's a weakening of sovereignty. There's a bit of an empowerment of forms of international organization, regional and global. And there is the emergence of a global civil society. And we need to take much more, do more careful studies of the full reach and potentials of global civil society. So in effect then, it looks as if we are at a cusp where whoever defines the future of global society, global political order, and global law, global international law, will have to confront exactly where sovereignty is and what are the other centers of authority and control that can serve as a form of balancing and at the same time protecting the basic values of humanity and moving forward in a progressive way. So that's what I see the challenge as being. And then one last point, I had mentioned in this note that there is the idea that we already have a global constitutive process. It is very rooted in the UN Charter, although it's not like ordinary national constitutional processes. It has different characteristics, but in its fundamentals, a great deal of the foundations of authority and control are there, but they're not as effective. They're not as operational as they should be. And so then we have, maybe the last point here is, can we use our thought and insight to strengthen the idea that there is a global constitutive process, that there are things that can be changed in that process, and that we can make the kinds of recommendations that are constructive for humanity. That's it.
If I can take the advantage before I forget them, we can hear different questions and then give you come back to you. So I'll just put a few questions first. I think that if I've understood your approach, you have been talking about what is the legitimacy of a concept of a global constitutive process or sovereign rights of all humanity. Mm-hmm. Could we? My first question is, I'd like you to talk a little bit or talk more about this global constitutive process. Mm-hmm. What is it? And the second question is, I understand that if we're trying to argue from the legitimacy of the nation state, mm-hmm. or the legitimacy of what nation states have already conceded, mm-hmm. That the question of transcending national sovereignty may be problematic from the legal point of view.
Yes. And political.
Okay, and political point of view. And I suppose the movement from monarchy to democracy was fairly problematic from the political point of view also. So I'd like to approach it from a different angle, and that is, and I hope this is a theme that we can discuss not only here but in Geneva. Instead of just considering the question of its legitimacy, in order to address the problems that humanity has today, can we talk about its justification, its utility? The move from monarchy to democracy, though it was done in the name of ideals, was done also for very pragmatic purposes. And my own understanding is, in our discussion of nuclear weapons and other things, that the evolution of the global community, the safety and welfare of humanity, is being held hostage to a notion that has outlived its utility, at least in its absolute state. I think it would be also interesting to explore if a different notion, if a different foundation for global governance was recognized, to what extent that be an important contributor to addressing the problems we have today, to solving the problems, the global crises that are the topic of our discussion in Geneva and in
All right.
Alexandria.
Let me just take some terminology first. Some theorists are a little uneasy about the term legitimacy. And that is because legitimacy doesn't necessarily mean authority. You can legitimate something by some pre-existing principle of validation, like the divine right of kings, okay? So there's an uneasy about legitimacy. Many prefer to see law and politics as rooted in authority, okay? And where does authority come from? It comes from the people, you see. It comes from, if you like, from a global point of view, from the global, if you like, civil society, and so on. Just one point. So I'm uneasy about them, but I can see that these terms are sometimes used interchangeably, although, as I said, I prefer the use of authority. Now, your second point is the disutility of sovereignty as conventionally understood. Well, that's not too difficult a problem. I think what we have to do, in fact, the agenda at the UN meeting, I think, represents a cluster of problems that clearly transcend the nation state. Okay? They are not problems that can be handled by any particular nation state alone, all right? Or even a few of them, you see. These are problems of global inclusive importance, and as such, the problems are climate change, the problems of global poverty and unemployment. Every one of these things ultimately has a reach that is beyond the nation state. So if you're asking me then, how useful is the sovereignty idea in a world that is now far more interdependent and in which events are interdetermining globally? It's just not sufficiently functionally useful to respond effectively to these challenges, you see. Mm-hmm. That's where I would go. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, so the concept of sovereignty has outlived its utility, okay? Mm-hmm. And it's outlived its utility a long time ago because it was a central weakness in maintaining global security, Mm-hmm. Now, if you're asking me then what's next on the agenda, well, then you still have the problem which I noticed. I was looking at a video of Martin, the English guy, who also looks at global problems from an interdisciplinary point of view. But then, the question that he has to be confronted with is, okay, now we know the problem. We've got all the interdisciplinary insights as to what we should do about climate change, what its effects are going to be, what short-term, long-term, whatever. We know this, but how do you give it operational effect? Well, you have to do that through essentially some form of law or some form of regulatory management, okay? And that's essentially where the rule of law comes in. He gives an illustration, for example, that not only climate change, but cosmocorps. Many of these corporations have a GDP higher than many states. Walmart apparently has a GDP twice that of Israel. And then the question is, well, who regulates the cosmocorps? The states, the sovereigns have imperfect regulation. The cosmocorps resist regulatory standards from any particular sovereign, partly because they function globally. And more than that, what his research indicates is that the major corporations in particular fields are locked into each other by computer networks and can act in concert in ways that dwarf the capacity of even great nation states to control and regulate them. So then the question is, well, should they be subject to regulation through the UN? Well, the UN has tried to regulate cosmocorps with ethical standards, but they are there and ignored. And so the question then is, do we need a better form of regulating the global economy in terms of all these different components, finance, manufacturing, that kind of stuff? Or can you leave it to anarchy? You see? So there you see the great challenge of the rule of law. I mean, can we imagine a framework of regulatory standards that says the objectives of corporate business are not purely and exclusively shareholder interest. They function in a world in which there are larger interests and larger values, and those values have to be accounted for in corporate decision making. And they can be responsible if they don't, you see. Now we have a great, I think, global ideological debate. Clearly, the nation state itself has failed in many respects with regard to the way in which it can construct the rule of law to develop regulatory standards that don't either overreach or underreach. They've been dysfunctional. And so the question then is that because the nature of the problems are not purely internal to sovereigns, but in fact the nature of the problems are international, are global, if you like. And that means you can't really you have very imperfect lawmaking if one sovereign is trying to regulate the labor standards of Bangladesh 8,000 miles away. You know? So that means we are forced to come back to the idea of a global rule of law. Well, how are you going to give institutionalized efficacy to a global rule of law? Well, you've got to have a global constitution that's respected. Now, we have the outlines of such a constitution in the UN Charter, but we aborted the efforts to seriously reform the Charter. I think, I don't know where to put the blame precisely, but several years ago, Bolton, the U.S. ambassador, showed up with about 600 amendments on the day that they were supposed to vote to accept the major recommendations, and that scuttled the whole thing. So we didn't even get the effort to reshape the Charter, and we need to ask those basic questions about how to reshape it, how to make it more accountable, how to make it transparent and responsible as well, and how to give it efficacy. But I think the rule of law doesn't mean anything if you don't have a constitution which it sustains, and the constitution must have authority and control to be effective, and that authority and control must be fully global in its reach.